Hello everybody, today let's talk about Throne and Liberty. This is a Korean MMO that was released in December of 2023 in Korea, South, not North, and is now making its way to the rest of the world, set to come out on the 1st of October 2024, with early access being 5 days earlier than that. Okay, if you just want to know whether you should try this game or not, I won't waste your time. I've been playing the Korean version of this game for some time now, and I genuinely have had a great time. That plus the fact that it will be free to play, I definitely think you should give it a shot and play this game when it comes out. So let me just get it out of the way for the low attention span zoomers, because I do not have any Subway Surfers clips on hand. This game pretty much has my seal of approval. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for more MMO content, but for some of you who think like me, that's not gonna be enough, because like me, you've seen all the countless videos about how Throne and Liberty is just not a good MMO, and is pretty much set up to fail. Truthfully, most of that criticism, even if it comes from MMO doomers like Asmongold, is kind of true. Okay, the thing with this game is that it kind of confuses me with whether it's good or not. It does a few things right, and it does a few things wrong, but for the most part, it does everything else kinda meh. Okay, fine, maybe I'm being a little bit vague, so you'll watch the rest of the video, but to be honest, we kinda have to talk about it. So okay, let's talk about it. Okay, let's start where all MMOs start. Character creation. Throne and Liberty is a Korean MMO, and like other Korean games, comes with a detailed and extensive character creation menu. You have control over most features of a character, with more options for faces, and honestly, you have a ton of freedom to create the exact character you want. Now, I will say this isn't really best in class for an MMO, because that title definitely goes to Black Desert Online, but the one thing that Throne and Liberty does better is the diversity of features available. Most East Asian games with character creation tends to lean very heavily towards East Asian features, which generally makes sense since that's the target audience at first, but it's always a little disappointing when those games eventually release globally. Throne and Liberty suffers from this too, for sure, but in general, it's noticeably better than even Black Desert Online is. The big downside though is that there are no races to choose from, such as dwarves or orcs or anything besides a human, which feels a bit limiting, but on the plus side, unlike a lot of other East Asian games, you are not gender locked by your class. You're actually not even locked into a class at all, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. The big innovation that Throne and Liberty has though is this crazy cool feature where you can upload a photo of a face and it will generate a character based on it. I don't think I've ever seen this feature in a major MMO before, and it's extremely futuristic and super cool. It's also a little bit creepy. They promise not to store the photo, but I trust corporations about as much as I trust a random person on the street. But the bigger problem though is that the feature is honestly not very good. Okay, here, look, I'll demonstrate. Here's a photo of the actor Paul Rudd that I got from the internet because I don't know the guy personally. As you can see, when I upload it, the character is well, he's definitely not the actor Paul Rudd. In fact, I have no idea who this guy is. Looks like a nice guy, I don't love his hair, but this is not Paul Rudd. Okay, maybe it was a fluke. Let's try another one. Here's a photo of Chris Pratt, famous of course for playing Mario and nothing else, that I also got from the internet. Let's put this in and yep. This is not Chris Pratt. Again, no idea who this is. Kinda looks like Michael Bublé, I guess. But yeah, it's not very good. Overall though, the character creation is pretty awesome for the most part, and in a vacuum, I have very few complaints. However, and this is kind of the common theme here in this video, it isn't anything special, given that Black Desert Online had pretty much the same features, if not more, almost a decade ago on release. And the one new feature that Throne and Liberty has that could have made it special, the upload a photo feature, is unfortunately, honestly, just not very good. Okay, let's move on to the next thing you'd notice when playing a new MMO, the visuals and the world. This game is absolutely gorgeous. Really, there are views worth photographing in every corner of the map. Now, the visuals aren't best in class compared again to Black Desert Online, but it's still very pretty. On top of this, every location in the game, from the cities to the forest to the ruins, feels thematically consistent. Cities and towns are laid out in a believable system and in sensible locations, and they're connected by road systems that also make sense. Now, you might be going, Kets, what the hell are you talking about? The way that it's laid out? Who cares? Trust me, you always notice when a world doesn't make sense, and Throne and Liberty's does make sense, which is great to see. Now, the one thing I don't quite like is the ability to quickly teleport across the world map. Now, this is convenient, sure, but it ends up just making the world feel way smaller than it actually is, because you don't ever actually need to travel across it. Even worse though is that because nobody travels across it manually, it makes it so that the regions between the teleporters feel quite empty. And eventually, when the rush of new players on launch die down, I worry that this will make the new player areas even more empty over time. Overall though, this game has a really interesting and well thought out world that is fleshed out with super pretty graphics that can definitely make you stop and stare for a while. So Throne and Liberty definitely does really well in this category. Okay, so once you've made your character and you've decided that you like the world, the next step in an MMO is to figure out character progression. Now this works a little different in Throne and Liberty compared to other MMOs. First of all, there actually aren't any classes in this game. Instead, the skills available to you depend on the weapons you have equipped. Now you can equip 2 weapons and there's actually no difference between a primary or secondary weapon. You get the stats and access to the skills of both weapons with no penalties. You can also freely equip different weapons, so you're never actually locked into a class on your character, which I think is actually really great. And on top of this, since there's limited slots for skills and limited skill points, there's actually a ton of room for variety in builds. Obviously, metas will still exist because min-maxing and tier lists are like cocaine to MMO players, but you're never actually forced to play with the same weapon or skill combinations as everyone else. You want to be a greatsword wielding mage? You absolutely can. You can even be a greatsword wielding mage that's different in playstyle to another greatsword wielding mage. You might look like a maniac, but who cares? It's fun to be off meta. And the class system, and I'm saying this with air quotes, that they've come up with is genuinely awesome and genuinely deep. The downside though is that the leveling process from 0 to the max level, which right now is 50, is relatively quick because just following the main storyline will get you almost the whole way there. I don't really like it when MMOs have a short leveling process and focus entirely on the end game gameplay loop, and unfortunately Throne and Liberty definitely falls into that category of game. However, the unique and super interesting class system more than makes up for this, and it's a very refreshing and great take on one of the main components of the genre. So in this category as well, I think Throne and Liberty has done a really good job. Okay, so you've managed to level up and get yourself some new skills. So let's look at what it's like to use those skills in combat. So Throne and Liberty's combat system is tab-targeted action combat. Wait, what? Tab-targeted action combat? Okay, let's unpack that. The camera movement in this game has 2 modes, action and classic. In action mode, the camera moves automatically as you move your mouse left and right. This makes looking around very easy, and it's much easier for people that are used to action combat games. In classic mode, you move the camera by left clicking and dragging your mouse left and right. This allows you to move independently of whatever you're looking at and will be better and easier for people who are used to tab targeted games. I will say though, regardless of which mode you choose, using skills is pretty smooth in this game and combos flow pretty nicely from skill to skill. This is especially impressive considering that with 2 weapons equipped, you can have 2 completely different skill sets, and even with weapons that seemingly contradict each other, like a staff and a dagger maybe, it flows surprisingly well with little to no gaps. However, the combat system as a whole feels off. And after a lot of playing around with it, I think I figured out why. And it's that the system kind of contradicts itself. On one hand, you have the targeting system itself. Despite the skills being more action-based than something like World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy XIV, it's still almost fully tab targeted, with most of your skills being auto-aimed at the target you've selected and target switching done via a hotkey. On the other hand, skill combos can be pretty fast sometimes, and the number of actions per minute can be pretty high depending on which weapon you're playing. Then on a third hand that you have for some reason, movement and mobility is kind of weird. You have these spikes of high mobility due to skills, and then very jarringly, it goes right back to slow manual running around. Now these things aren't necessarily bad by themselves, except for the movement one, which I do think is kind of bad, but more than anything, they together create this weird sort of insoluble mix between a tab targeted slower paced game and an action combat faster paced game, where instead of the 2 concepts blending together to create something better, they kind of just end up clashing and going back and forth between each other. It kind of feels like in trying to be both action combat and tab targeted at once, it isn't as good as either of those things could be by themselves. For me, combat is probably the most important aspect of Throne and Liberty since so much of its activities are based around it, and so to me, it honestly needed to be a bit better. Don't get me wrong, it's still good. I wouldn't say it's bad per se by any stretch of the imagination. It's just a bit confused about what it's supposed to be. So I said just now that most of Throne and Liberty's activities are focused around combat, and that of course includes PvE and PvP. Throne and Liberty actually offers a ton of content in both player versus environment and player versus player scenarios. In PvE, you've got raids and dungeons, overworld bosses that spawn in various locations, loads and loads of quests, puzzles to complete, pieces of lore to gather that are spread out around the world, and actually just overall a pretty large world to explore in total. There are metas to weapon combinations for various activities in PvE, but in general, most combinations are serviceable and will work well enough to not have too much trouble. The bosses are a little stereotypical looking for a fantasy MMO, but they are well designed, and the boss fights themselves are complex enough that learning them and learning how they work is an obtainable skill. This is of course a good thing because that means there's a lot of room to grow in PvE, so honestly it doesn't get as repetitive as quickly as some other MMOs tend to do. PvE all in all is pretty good and I don't really have too many complaints about it. That all said though, the real focus of this game is actually its PvP. There's loads of PvP, all of it optional of course, in this game. The most basic form is your run-of-the-mill open world PvP. This means that you can fight people around the world outside of safe zones, which are typically cities, if everyone consents. Beyond that though, there's arenas and battlegrounds for organized solo and team-based PvP, and beyond even that lies Throne and Liberty's big specialty: massive large-scale battles for territory. These sieges involve guilds battling it out over territory and rewards, and this can lead to all-out wars that involves hundreds if not thousands of players at once. Now I know what you're thinking. Well, great! Sounds like a fun way to lag myself out of the game. I can't wait to disconnect in the middle of a siege. Somehow, they've made performance during these sieges actually pretty good. Good enough at least to be really fun. So actually these sieges are a massive selling point for this game, and rightfully so. The only issue though is that balancing, as you'd expect, is not that good. Certain combinations of weapons are very clearly better than others, and even though in PvE you can make anything work, it still does have a noticeable impact. And in PvP, it's honestly really difficult to make some of the worst combinations work. That said though, there's actually just so much content in both PvP and PvE in this game, partially a benefit of the game already having been released in Korea for a year, and so you'll honestly find a ton of stuff to do before you get bored, which is of course a great thing for any MMO. Okay, even though combat is most of this game, it isn't everything. Sort of. Throne and Liberty, like most other MMOs, does have skilling and crafting. This game comes with some variety of skilling activities, from fishing to cooking, often to cook the fish you catch, to crafting. Most of the skilling stuff is so-so at best. Pretty standard stuff that almost any other MMO has, with nothing in particular worth talking about. The crafting system though is pretty extensive and gives you the ability to craft many of the weapons and armor you'll be using as you progress through the game. Unfortunately though, the crafting in this game feels more like an unnecessary middleman than an actual fleshed out system. The reason it feels that way is mostly because to craft anything of worth, you actually end up needing drops from PvE mobs and bosses anyway. You can't go out and peacefully gather all the materials you need. You have to fight these bosses and kill these mobs to craft stuff. This means that instead of it being its own system with its own progression and gameplay, it's more like just another step in the same old combat-based progression. This to me is a massively wasted opportunity. I mean, why not make crafting a separate system where you go out, gather materials, and come back and craft different things? Doing it that way would add a whole new gameplay loop for those interested in doing that alone, being a crafter or a simple trader, and even beyond that, it would offer something for hardcore PvE and PvP players to do when they get bored of fighting. But instead, because the crafting system requires combat anyway, this game is just entirely combat. So all in all, skilling and crafting in Throne and Liberty is not very good or very fleshed out, which is genuinely a shame because that's one of my favorite aspects of MMOs. And with that, we've reached the big question everyone always has with any new MMO release, especially MMOs that come from the East. Is Throne and Liberty pay to win? The short answer is, yup. The slightly longer answer is, yup, it does, but only in the Korean version, maybe. Pay to win manifests in two main ways in Throne and Liberty Korea. The first of these is the battle passes. These have a free tier and a paid tier, with the paid tier giving out extra materials that are used to upgrade gear in the game. Needless to say, this is pretty clearly a real money to in-game boost conversion. The upside though is that the materials the battle pass gives you and the quantity of these materials it gives isn't significant in the long run. The downside though is that that argument only works if you consider the amount you get get from one battle pass. Someone who always buys every battle pass will clearly get more materials than someone who never buys the battle pass. This part isn't an opinion, that's literally just how that works. The other problem is the player market. In Throne and Liberty, for some reason, wink wink, the player market runs on the premium currency. I don't really know how to present this positively because it's quite literally spending real money to buy stuff to use in the game, including equipment. Now, I don't know about you guys, but multiple ways of converting real money, whether that's US dollars or kangaroo dollars, into useful items including gear is pretty crazy. The big argument defending this that people have is that you'd have to spend a lot of money, like thousands of dollars, to outdo someone who really grinds for the items instead. The problem with this argument, besides it being weirdly bootlicker behavior, is twofold. The first problem is that that's literally how pay to win is defined. The amount doesn't matter. Paying real money to get ahead instead of grinding, that's pay to win by definition. The second problem is that, okay, let's say someone who spends $1,000 can avoid grinding for 100 hours. What if they spend $1,000 and also grind for 100 hours on top of that? People that spend a lot of money on MMOs also tend to play those MMOs a lot. So this argument honestly just doesn't work that well at all. Now, I'm speaking with a lot of gusto, but I don't want to exaggerate the effect of pay to win in Throne and Liberty. I want to be very clear. It's entirely doable for a free-to-play player with enough time to grind and enough skills to outmaneuver their opponents to keep up with the whales. Entirely doable. In fact, a good chunk of the leaderboards are actually just free-to-play players. And on top of that, again, this is the Korean version of the game. The developers have promised to get rid of all pay-to-win in the global release. Can they? Maybe. Will they? Probably not, but maybe they'll cut out just enough of it that it isn't as intrusive as it is in the Korean version. The bottom line is though, for me personally, having played almost every major MMO release in the last decade and a half, I think the pay to win in the Korean version of Throne and Liberty is a bit much, and I would never blame you for not wanting to play it. That said, if the global version is even 50% less pay to win, that equation changes a lot, and I would definitely consider it something you could look past. Okay, so with everything we've talked about so far, let's expand on the title of this video a little bit more. Throne and Liberty is a genuinely fun new MMO. It has a ton of different content and a few unique systems that make it stand out in the genre. However, besides the class system and the large-scale sieges, it doesn't do anything amazing. Everything about it is kind of average to above average in general, and the class system and the sieges, which actually are amazing, isn't quite enough to push it over other established MMO or even some of the MMOs that are still to come out. All that said though, even if it's an MMO that only does things well and not amazing, it's still a free-to-play MMO that does things well. That alone should justify giving it a go, and I genuinely do recommend that you do. Plus, if the siege system actually does look appealing to you, this should be pretty much a no-brainer because there's really no other MMO in the market right now that does it better than Throne and Liberty. You might like it, you might not, but at the end of the day, the game does look promising and I don't think you'd lose anything by giving it a go. But anyway, that's enough yapping from me. What do you think? Was I fair in my assessment of this game? Will you be playing it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to my channel for more MMO content. Thank you for watching and I'll see you guys next time. I don't have any outro music.